And Ranjit Hoskote, along with Jennifer Robertson as the moderator, discussing the book Confluences, Forgotten Histories from East and West, which Ranjit and Ilija wrote together and was published in 2012. Ilija Trojanow is a writer, translator, and publisher, and founded the Merino Publishing House in 1989, which specialized in African literature. In the early 90s, he traveled extensively through Africa. In 1998, he moved to Bombay for 5 years. In 2001, he undertook a 3-month-long journey on foot through Tanzania in the footsteps of the explorer Sir Richard Francis Burton. Since then, he has lived in Cape Town and Vienna and published a number of novels and non-fiction books. He is the recipient of a number of literary awards, and his work has been translated into several languages such as Spanish, Dutch, Russian, and so on. Ranjit Hoskote, our next panelist, is a leading Anglophone Indian poet and has been acclaimed as a seminal contributor to Indian art criticism. Poet, cultural theorist, and curator, he is the author of 30 books, including Vanishing Acts, Central Time, and I, Lala, the poems of Lal Dead. With Ilija, he has co-authored Confluences. He has also curated the 7th Gwangju Biennale in 2008 and was the curator of India's first ever national pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2011. Jennifer Robertson, who will be moderating the session, is a Bombay-based contemporary Indian poet and critic. Her essays have appeared in publications such as the American Book Review, Scroll, and The Telegraph. Her poems have been published in The Missing Slate, 40 Under 40, an anthology of post-globalization poetry, and the Urban Myths and Legends anthology. She is the convener for literary events hosted by the PEN All India Centre. Her first poetry manuscript was selected for the Editor's Choice Award by the Great Indian Poetry Collective and will be published this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Khurshid, for the wonderful introduction and a very warm welcome to everybody here this evening. I'd like to open the evening with a quote from the book. It's a quote by Homi K. Baba. To the inhabitants of the in-between, we should remember that it is the cutting edge of translation and negotiation, the in-between space that carries the burden of the meaning of culture. I'd like to welcome you, Ranjit and Ilija. Before we really start talking about the book and the various collaboration that you have had over the years, I would like, Ilija, for you to expound on the notion of confluence itself. I think it's interesting, it'll be interesting for the audiences to really know what that means and how it has impacted the collaborations over the year between the two of you.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here because when I was living in Bombay, I actually used to be a member of this library. And I remember very calm, wonderful hours of reading up there with the big fans circling forever. I think I would like to explain the concept of confluence by telling you of a journey I undertook a few years back to Brazil. And in the rainforest, there are two huge rivers that meet at a place called Manaus. One is called the Rio Negro, and the other is called the Rio Solimões. And the two rivers are completely different. So they have a very differing alluvial content, they have a different acidity, they have a different temperature, they have a different color, a very different color. It's nearly white and black. And actually you can take a boat and you can ride in the middle of the river, and on your left is one river, on your right is the other river, for about 20 kilometers. And it's such a long time before they actually merge that if this was a snapshot, you would be forgiven for believing that these two rivers, the twain shall never meet, that these two rivers will always be apart. But 20 kilometers later, they form one river, the famous Amazonas. And suddenly, for someone living on the banks of this river after these 20 kilometers, he would also be forgiven for believing that this is the river, this is identity, this is the culture that he knows, and he would, unless he travels upstream to the traditions of these occurring confluences, he would think that this is his cultural identity. This river of mixed alluvial compounds, of mixed temperatures, and of a color that is somewhere between black and white. So I think this is the imagery that which made us choose this particular title for the book.
Ranjit, would you like to add to that?
I think we were both fascinated by this sense of the meeting of very dissimilar energies or impulses. And it came to us also in the form of this wonderful metaphor, but also because in the work we'd done separately up to that point, we began with a certain skepticism towards received narratives about culture, about identity, and for reasons which I think we'll talk about as we go along, neither of us has a conventional, fixed, stable, regional or linguistic identity. So there's always, even in, so to speak, an inherited sense, we've grown up with the idea of living across borders, living between languages. So there's, for both of us, a natural skepticism towards this kind of very strong notion of what belongs inside and what is to be kept outside. Yeah. So also I have to say that we, having researched and worked on this book for many, many years, we actually sat down and wrote it on what I like to call the Rhine-Main Sangam. It was the Mainz. It was the city of Mainz. It was the Gutenberg Museum, which again had this incredible...
To translate Mainz into Indian, it would be the Allahabad of Germany. Yeah.
That's true. The Prayag, Allahabad of Germany. So that also was amazing. It was to sit on the ghats of the river, of the Rhine-Main Sangam, and to think about what we were doing. There's an incredible energy that emanates from this sense of very different things coming together and producing a third thing, which again is a Freudian idea that Bhabha is very fond of invoking. The idea that you can bring together dissimilar elements and then produce something that could not have been predicted. And it's exactly that unpredictability which people who insist on hard-edged identities find very difficult to deal with, as we're seeing in the world around us.
One very important thing that I sort of took away while I started reading the book was this notion that society can only function when they boast of a homegrown culture, and that has developed from the core of certain notion, one tradition, one religion, one people. I think this book also tries to dismantle that notion. Was that the objective, or how did you go about approaching this particular notion, through the various stages of the book? Could you talk a little about that? Yeah, Ilija.
Well, I think we reached that kind of theoretical aspect of the book by living and cooperating in Bombay. So I think in Bombay one is surrounded by so many fluid identities. And the interesting thing is that fluid identity in itself is a contradiction, because identity, when you look at the Latin, means something that always stays the same. So basically I think our initial point of departure was that actually what is called liminal, so what is regarded as being an exception, as being at the borders, is actually the center, while most things that are regarded as tradition are appropriations that came later. And I actually lived in Tadio, and I would quite often go to Haji Ali, to the Haji Ali Dargah, and it struck me that you would really see, every time I went, you would see people of different faiths going there, and you could actually see the mingling of beliefs and expectations as you walked across the causeway. And I think one of the very early sentences that we wrote down was, tradition is nothing but a mixing and mingling that has been forgotten. And I think the other point was that because of our interests in our biographies, we ourselves experienced how traditions are constructed, how they're invented, how they're made, So this is also a misconception of many people, that tradition is a continuum. While actually tradition is a creative process, and it depends on a certain discourse, dialogue on one hand, but also conflict and confrontation on the other hand.
Thank you. It's interesting that you speak about identity, and a while ago we were talking about this notion that you approach this book and the whole idea of Confluence not only as theorists but also as practitioners. So, and I think both of you have interesting personal histories to back that up. Would you like to first, if you could talk about your personal history as to how that has impacted your writing? Both fiction and non-fiction, because I think it makes for...
I come from a family of Kashmiri Pandits who left Kashmir a few centuries ago. I don't know why they ended up in Karnataka. And actually our family village is called Hoskote. And so I'm basically, I'm I think I learned English quite early in life. I can't remember. But also there were so many other influences all around me. So the Konkani, of course, living in Bombay, the Hindi Marathi, the openness towards a multilingual, a polyglot reality. Now, I don't know, what about you?
Well, I'm a Bulgarian to begin with, which is evident.
Gosh, these Bulgarians are good looking, man.
Well, so are the Kashmiri Pandits. Let's not congratulate ourselves. But I grew up in this Bulgarian family, which for evident political reasons had to find ways of leaving what was clearly a repressive political system. And then the family had this extraordinary journey of adventure, moving first to northeastern Italy, remaining there in difficult circumstances, and moving on to a larger world of travel and relocation that involved Germany and Kenya, growing up in very different continents, and therefore also being open to living in this liminal space between languages, ethnicities, races, very different temperaments and traditions, which is probably what has led to this responsiveness to being in another place. So the first instincts would be not to be trapped in a notion of what the self is. It's to explore how porous the borders between self and other are.
Another very fascinating thing is that you've started writing poetry in English, but you claim to have come to love German as a language. Do you think people who write in their second or third language sort of arrive at loving their mother tongue, or could you talk a little about that?
Well, I think there's generally a misconception, and it's quite often encountered in Germany, that someone who learned the language at a later stage in life would in some way be encumbered by that, and that actually he is using some kind of crutches to move along in his literary production. I think actually the opposite is true. When you were at an age in which you actually consciously acquired this language, it was a process that you actively pursued, that you were an active part of. It was not a gift that was placed in the cradle. So because of that, there's a certain awareness and a certain attentiveness to the language that makes us, I think, more or forces us to be stylists. Because of course style is something that is produced. Style is very rarely something that comes out of an instinctive, well, there are maybe a few geniuses, but normally style is the result of hard work of both reflection and practice. So in a way, I've actually come to think that this is an advantage, and because of this advantage, I'm emotionally very, very. There's no other way to put it. I'm really in love with the German language, but there are actually, every day that I write, there are moments when I look at a phrase, an idiom, a word, and I think to myself, this is so incredibly beautiful. So there's this awe, this, as you said, stepping out of yourself, because the language fits you very well, but at the same time, it's not your skin, it's a cloth. So I think that would be the major difference.
I want to pick up on what you said about stepping out of yourself, which is actually a literal translation of the Greek ekstasis. It's ecstasy. So it's a condition of being outside of yourself and somehow exhilarated. And I think that that is what language can do for you. It sets you into this other kind of relationship to the world. So it's not just an instrument. There's also a kind of sacramental connection with language. And I also want to say that linguistic experiences are very, very complex. I think we are, particularly by nationalists or sub-nationalists or nativists, we're somehow led to believe that language is, your relationship to language is geared only one particular way. That is a myth that is only about as old as the Romantic movement. If you look, for instance, at Sheldon Pollock's wonderful studies of what he calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis, that is a way of looking at the world from Western India through to Southeast Asia, where a whole range of different people were brought together because they shared a particular language and inflected it, Sanskrit. You can look at the Arabic ecumeny in the same way. Everything from West Africa to really, again, Southeast Asia. There's an ecumeny that works with and around a single, seemingly classical language, but which inflects it in different ways. We all have very different historical relationships to language. Again, Pollock makes the point that the idea of the mother tongue was actually unknown until fairly recently. It's another of the ideas that comes up with the Romantic notion of that, the one race, the one language, the one territory.
I'd like to speak about the bit on the Sanskrit translations that you were talking about. Earlier we spoke about the fact that you're still in the process of translating some Sanskrit poets. One, I would like for you to talk about the process and also reflect on the question that is the question of language really politicized? Because, here you're talking about this, from really two ends of the spectrum. There are love poems that you're looking at translating, and yet I would want you to talk about the politics of language as well. Yeah.
I keep signaling to my alma mater, but it's really where Elphinstone College at a certain point was really this crucible of many wonderful things, including its language departments. So my first encounter with Sanskrit was at home, but as formal study it was here. And anyone who studies Sanskrit seriously very rapidly realizes that there is an ocean, literally the great ocean, of secular literature. And all you hear of Sanskrit today, whether in the context of family or community or even the nation, is a language that seems indissolubly wedded to religion, to ritual, to high-mindedness. There's erotica, there's pornography, there is satire. And I have to say, Anandnarayan Haksar, who is this one-man army of translation from secular Sanskrit literature, is someone I think of as an ideal, And it is a political question because it's a way of reclaiming what seems to be a classical language and to recognize the diverse ways in which it's addressed the sumptuousness of human experience. It's exactly what we were talking about earlier. I mean, it's a way of dismantling the idea of the classical as something remote and unidimensional. When you look at it closely, you actually find its hybridities that we've forgotten. And therefore, it's political because we need to reclaim it. There's also a way in which we cede many things to the right wing, assuming that they must somehow, by definition, be conservative, and that is not the case.
You've mentioned, both of you have mentioned in the book, that culture is the eternal shapeshifter. Only by interacting with the other can a culture keep itself alive. I want you to talk a little about that, Ilija, the whole sense of otherness and how it impacts Confluences.
Well, let's maybe start off with a few examples. Since we're living now in the age of Trump, it's always amazed me that the greatest export of the American culture throughout the world in the 20th century, pop music, actually came out of utter and complete segregation. It came from the black American ghetto. So it was very much at the beginning a musical tradition that was carried with the slave ships across the ocean, which was used also as a language of self-comfort and self-identification, which was very much, I think, an element of cohesion, an element of rebellion. And it took centuries before this music actually broke out of the ghetto. For a long time, there was it was very politicized because jazz was dominated by white people doing what they actually they copying what Afro-Americans had been doing. And then gradually it kind of overcame these political boundaries, and it became the mass culture of the whole universe. And stories like that abound in our book, and sometimes they're reasonably well known, like the one I just mentioned. Others are very, very surprising, even to people who are well familiar with the subject. And one thing that, since you mentioned Mainz, now for those who know Germany, there's a very good soccer club. And for the soccer fans among you, probably most of you, the coach then, when we were there, was a guy called Jürgen Klopp, who's now the coach of Liverpool, very famous German coach. So since I was the town laureate, I met up with him and we did a discussion about literature and football. And I said to him, well, what I would suggest next time you have a game in your stadium is for the stadium speaker to tell all the fans who are screaming, ole, 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 ole. I don't know whether that's also sang in India, but that's kind of the main chorus in Germany in the stadium, to inform the 60,000 fans, agitated, that this actually comes from Andalusia, south of Spain, and it's a Spanish version of Allah. So actually all these German fans are screaming Allah, 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 which might slightly confuse and irritate them in today's times. But this is more anecdotal, but it shows that in a way what we did was cultural archaeology. And the archaeological process was necessary only for one reason, because there are politically dominated narratives that are, with a certain delay, with a certain time lag, are kind of written over this history of continuous dynamic development.
Since you discussed soccer and spoke about Klopp, I'll probably jump my own personal narrative and talk about a particular note that mentions the quote at Wimbledon. Ranjit, could you please tell us the story behind that and how it's linked to Pontius and the Bhagavad Gita? I just found that entire thing so fascinating. I mean, for an uninitiated reader, it's absolutely fantastic reading. So could you talk a little about that? Yeah.
You're the real Sanskritist. So
No.
do you remember the lines?
No, but yeah, of course, I'm the real Sanskritist as a Kashmiri Pandit, but my shishya here needs to practice, so I'll let you...
Shishya's memory is like a sieve. It's gone. What are the lines? What are the lines from Kipling's If?
Come on, I'm older than you.
I have to look in the book. I really have... No, but anyway, to summarize, it's the lines that are above the main chord, which seem to come out of Kipling's, and they do come out of Kipling's If. But in the way in which they define what the ideal person should be, one who is not thrown by the storms of exaltation or depression on one side or the other, you have to quote the lines. Good old Kipling, colonialist though he was. He was a Bombay boy, so you have to quote him.
No, it's something along the lines that those who accept both victory and defeat, or triumph and defeat, with the same magnitude are those who kind of deserve it, or it's probably much. Do you have the original?
I found it. It's, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. I think you've quoted that bit. Yeah.
And that's the exact description of the Sthita Prajna, one who is not shaken by extremes of feeling, and that's the exemplar in the Bhagavad Gita. So it points to the presence of these texts, even at the heart of what seemed to be. Kipling was a complex case, but if you look, for instance, at the Boston Brahmins, the Transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, their thought is manifestly an engagement with Vedic and Upanishadic ideas. You know, there's a way in which, there's a passage in Thoreau, for instance, where he talks about how he imagines the blocks of ice that are being broken and shipped from Massachusetts to Calcutta, and he imagines that the waters of the East Coast will mingle with the waters of the Ganga. You know, so there was also that utopian transcultural impulse within what you might want to call Euro-American civilization at a certain point. So it is important to us to look at these minglings and encounters both ways, whether it's, so which actually makes nonsense of notions like East and West, because there are these embedded, forgotten stories on both sides, and we need to be attentive to this.
Well, also the interesting thing is, and it shows how nationalism strikes us with blindness, is that we all know that there was an ongoing process of interacting on an economic level. So everybody knows that Boston was the most important. There were more Boston traders in Zanzibar than from any other city in the world. There was an ongoing interaction with India, with especially the western seaboard of India. So all of that is well known. And same thing with the Silk Route and all these avenues of commerce, which have been described by thousands of historians. And yet very few of them asked a very simple story. Well, what else did these traders carry with them? Did they only carry goods with them? Or did they maybe carry stories with them? Did they carry convictions? Did they carry philosophies with them? Which of course makes sense. I mean, why would they travel without cultural luggage? So we tried to trace that, and we show actually how many stories, to give you one example, many stories from the Panchatantra are in the first book of European prose, which is a book written in Florence by a man called Boccaccio, the Decamerone. And when you look at its 100 stories and the structure of the narrative, this is another interesting thing. According to the Orientalist approach, a few things might have been taken from the East, but the structure of narration, the complexity of narration, is kind of a Western invention. While when you look at the structure of the Decameron, it's exactly the structure of something that is the main narrative tradition in the old Sanskrit, which is a story in a story, and the frame narrative. Within the frame narrative, you have smaller frames and so on. So like a Russian doll. And so we looked at the Panchatantra, we compared it to the Decameron, and I think it was from 100 stories, it was more than 20 that are basically retelling of Panchatantra stories. Very, very similar. I mean, a few small details adapted, but otherwise the same story. And we looked at Dante, and there you can evidently see a very, very prominent influence of certain Islamic narrations, apocryphal narrations, and so on and so forth. And the more you look at it through this prisma, the more you actually realize how culture was as susceptible to travel and interaction and therefore change as economy was.
Ranjit, would you like to add to that? We were discussing the little anecdote about Lorca and how the Qasidas, the poetry around Qasidas were influenced by Oriental forms. If you could expound a little bit on about that.
One of the strategies of our book was also to focus on particular moments, which could extend from a few decades to 800 years, as it did in Spain. And we were looking at these interface points, which were really more than interfaces. It's where two seemingly different things came together, like I said, to weave together. And it just irritated us constantly that there was reference, whether in academic work or in popular speech, to Moorish Spain. Some weird idea that the Arabs and the Muslims came from elsewhere. They spent 800 years here, and then they were, in the Reconquista, sent home. All of these ideas are spurious. They actually produced a new culture in Andalusia, and some scholars have glossed it as the convivencia, which was a way of being together. How could Muslims, Jews, and Christians find ways of being together for 8 centuries? Which no one is arguing that this is a utopian, idyllic situation. There were tensions, there were conflicts, but broadly there was an understanding that people had to live together, translate across languages and scriptures. And in that process, you have the most amazing things. You have, for instance, the foundational text of modern Judaism is written in Arabic by a figure who much later was called Maimonides. I mean, in his own life, he was called Musa ibn Maimun al-Qurtubi. If you look at that name, you think it's a Muslim name. If you look at his family, you realize that over the generations, they had practiced what particularly in Shiism is called taqiyya. a way of hiding, camouflaging your identity in different times. But out of that whole rich experience came this Arabic-speaking Jew who wrote the Dalalat al-Hayrin, the Guide to the Perplexed. So we're looking at the granularity of these experiences. Out of that came this amazing literary tradition in Al-Andalus, which involved qasidas, ghazals, which was discouraged after the Reconquista, after this notion that a sovereign Catholic identity had to be put in place. This continued very much under the Franco regime. So at some point you have this moment of redemption where Federico Garcia Lorca reaches back for these forms and brings them back into circulation, and they become an important current within Spanish literature.
Yeah, it's just to add one sentence. The Spain actually, after the Reconquista, and it was probably the most cultured place on earth, sank into an age-long slumber, culturally speaking. And it was kind of downhill for several centuries. And the kind of rejuvenation of Spanish culture came, above all, from Andalusia. Not only Lorca, Miguel Hernandez, and a few others, all the great poets, interestingly enough, from the poor south, seemingly underdeveloped, as people thought, but the greatest composer, Manuel de Falla. And when you look closely at the work of the poets and the work of the composers, you clearly see, and this is amazing, 400 years later, you clearly see so-called Oriental, whatever you might call them, but influences from, let's say, the Levant and the Mediterranean and North Africa and the Middle East and so on and so forth. So this is also interesting that even if it's buried deep, if it's suppressed and oppressed, centuries later it can still kind of have an influence on the cultural dynamics and creativity.
And not only that, it also functioned as a source of illumination for Christian Europe, which through that period, a certain kind of conventional history will tell us this was the Dark Ages. But in the far west, in Al-Andalus, was this illumination. So scholars, including future popes, traveled from Paris or from Rome to study in the universities of Al-Andalus. So it's worth holding on to that other history and to talk about how transfers of knowledge, transfers of culture, transfers of technology, I'm thinking here of a range of things, from mathematics to agricultural irrigation techniques to a whole culture of doubt and reason and philosophy, which actually emanates from this Islamic far west, and which then comes into what gets described as the Enlightenment. Now, once again, it's one of those origin myths in Europe where you believe that the Enlightenment represented some truly European selfhood and subjectivity. If you look at the origins of the Enlightenment, you will find that you trace your journey back to Ibn Sina and philosophers active in the Islamic world, Avicenna or Ibn Rushd, Averroes.
Well, I think, sorry, just to add one sentence, but I think it also makes more sense, just purely from a logical point of view, that things don't come out of nowhere. It's always irritated me to read kind of traditional histories where suddenly, within the framework of a national genius, something pops out of nowhere and you have this great flowering of a certain culture. I think it's far more logical, just pure common sense, to assume that there are all sorts of influences, there's all sorts of mingling, adaptations and so on, that has been going on and that we might not be aware of. So many of these stories are forever buried. We might not be able to reimagine them. Or they've been purposely suppressed because they don't fit into this narrative, as you said, of one state, one nation, one language.
This beautifully leads to my next question. You've reserved some of your most pointed criticism for the West's recent anti-Muslim backlash. And you've also coined the term Islamoclasm. I think in the current geopolitical climate, I think it becomes absolutely imperative to really discuss that. I would want both of you to talk about that bit. Ranjit.
Maybe because I've already kind of spoken of this, but to approach the contested present, I think it's across the world there is a certain notion of Islam as something monolithic. It rests in the first place on an ignorance of the history of the House of Islam. What has this meant across this whole span, from West Africa and Spain on the one hand to the Philippines on the other. Very simple notions, for instance, the idea that the image is proscribed or forbidden in Islam. The fact is, it's not. There's a very tense history of the image appearing into view, being banned, being replaced by calligraphy. There is a vigorous culture of debate within Islam. There is at one point, and we refer to it as the battle between the party of faith, the party of reason. These debates have been part of Islamic history. So you cannot use ignorance as your battering ram to demonize and destroy a whole religious tradition, which meanwhile is like a huge umbrella. So one of our appeals is for a certain attentiveness to the textures of what Islamic culture actually means or has meant, and that it has gone through as many cycles historically as any other such religious tradition that you might want to look at.
This is the philosophical approach. I would like to add a purely practical, geostrategical approach from the point of applied politics. If you demonize the whole of Islam, you're basically overlooking the most important fact, and that is that the extermination war that is going on of fanatics and Islamists is against Sufism. And the most people killed are Sufis. By far the heaviest destruction of cultural places, to put it generally, has been against Sufi places. Now, the International Court in Den Haag for the first time is suing someone who destroyed very, very old durgas in Timbuktu. But this is going on all over the place. I mean, Bamiyan in Afghanistan became a huge cause célèbre, but at the same time, for example, in Pakistan, there's been an ongoing extermination and eradication of Sufi presence. Now, basically by demonizing the whole religion and by overlooking the fact that this inner Islamic war of extermination is going on, you are supporting the radicals. Instead of, what I think should be the strategy, instead of supporting those forces and tendencies within Islam who are close to our understanding, and they exist, but they are under fire. And of course, geopolitically, by supporting the most horrible regimes in the world, like Saudi Arabia, for example, or like Pakistan, is just makes no sense whatsoever, because these people are exporting anti-confluential dogma and ideology, and therefore basically completely closing the door towards an Islam of the past as we describe it. And there's a certain blindness also amongst both EU and American administrations towards this complexity, which really troubles me. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes currently made.
Also, there's a way in which this whole current debate rests on notions of an Islam which has allegedly always been like this. The inattentiveness of this is breathtaking. The fact is that what you might want to call Salafism today is actually a modern phenomenon. Ayatollah Khomeini, who was usually pulled out as the great demon, was a modern thinker within the tradition of Islam. There is no prior justification for the jurist becoming a ruler. In fact, Shia tradition has been against that. It's been a quietist tradition.
Exactly the opposite.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite. So when he comes up with this, Khomeini, when he comes up with the idea of the Wilaya-i-Faqih, the mandate of the jurist, in a strange way, that was the one 20th century political revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution rested on ideas created in the 19th century, for instance. There's a way in which we have to recalibrate how we think of Islam. When you think of figures like Hassan al-Banna or Sayyid Qutb, who are the originators of what is loosely called jihad, look at these people. Sayyid Qutb was a poet. He went to Chicago. He spent time in America. It was an impact with America that, in a way, he invented this tradition of a pure, austere Islam.
Also a huge fan of Lenin.
Absolutely.
And the concept of Lenin is that a small party organization is the avant-garde of the revolution. So they can actually take over power and then later, in a very repressive, authoritarian way, pave the way for a general revolution. And this is exactly what these Islamist forces are doing. And of course, since we're in India, I think it's well known that important forethinkers of Hindutva were heavily influenced by Nazi ideology, which again is very much a modern phenomena, a departure from previous traditions. So yeah, it's important to keep that in mind.
It's interesting that you talk about Hindutva. There's an inspired passage, rather eccentric as well, of a VHP time traveler, which I find absolutely fascinating. If you could talk a little about that, it's wonderful storytelling as well.
Well, actually, we were sitting together and just, we were a little bit tired. So we thought, okay, let's have some fun. Since everybody in India tells you when you're a Gora, it tells you, you know, our tradition is 4,000 years, 5,000 years, 8,000 years, 10,000 years, 20,000 years. So we said, okay, let's take that seriously. Let's imagine a current pious Hindu pilgrim going back 2,000 years. And then we describe what he would have seen, and the guy would have fainted. He would have been absolutely shocked because none of his contemporary tenets would have been in place there. So basically he would have been in a he would have been traveling through a very alien religion, and he would have said, oh God, I mean, these are not believers at all. I have to get away from this place. So I think it was a very facile and entertaining way of showing how much these religious conventions are time and again reinvented, as opposed to being a continuum of theology.
It's also for us a way of adapting in different chapters, different kinds of literary forms. I mean, very early on we made the decision to not write this as an academic book for specialists. We wanted it to be more popular, more accessible. So how does one take a body of evidentiary material and make that accessible in a certain way? So that the time-traveling Hindu is really a way of looking at different kinds of irreconcilable evidence. You know, the fact is that there is a moment in the Kushan period where for the first time you have what we today call Hindu iconography, and its sources are not local. You know, how do you bring that in? Or the fact that the first reference to Vishnu as a high god is in the inscription that a Greek ambassador leaves. You know, it's what do you do with data like that? It's so easily brushed aside as a minor detail, but it's these details that tell you how things really evolved. So how does one bring that back to light? So it was also a question of, for instance, some of the chapters, the stories of the troubadours, for instance, those are deliberately written in the cadence of a fairy tale, or the time travel, or there's another tale of travel, the pepper trade, which is also told somewhere between really a poem and a song. So it was also a set of literary strategies.
Because of my love for linguistics, I would like to go back to that one chapter where you speak about the origin of alphabets. That's also a very interesting chapter or an excerpt. Could you talk a little about that?
Well, yeah, no, I'll give you I just wanted to introduce this particular subject by pointing out that in recent years, the way we are looking at ancient Greece has basically been redefined, because it was very much considered a European civilization. Now, the latest research shows that actually Troya, for example, was nowhere near where people think it was. It was probably much further to the east, and that many of these early and influential ancient Greek cities were in what is today's Turkey, and they were very much kind of open harbor cities where you had a lot of influx from Persians, Phoenicians, Egyptians, and so on. So this was the starting point to look at how did the alphabet actually develop.
Because for me, a truly inspiring figure always has been Martin Bernal, who, what was it, 35 or 40 years ago, he produced a book called Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Greek Civilization. And he was set upon by classicists, and there were actually denunciations signed by large numbers of classicists trying to shoot his theory down. And there might be a slightly eccentric edge to what he has to say, but the fact is people like Bernal have drawn our attention to this fact, that Greece did not emerge from nowhere. This suits a certain kind of European self-imagining. It's a neoclassical idea. Winkelmann certainly is a thinker who contributed to this notion. But if you look at the detail, again, the granularity, the texture, alpha, beta, gamma mean nothing much in Greek, but they come from Phoenician origins, alpu, betu, gamma, where they actually, those names for words actually refer to an ox, a house, and so on, you know? So you're looking at something that emerged from the exchanges that happen among traders in the Eastern Aegean. You're looking at the Mediterranean as a porous membrane which allowed for knowledge to go back and forth. And it completely takes away this idea of a unique origin. And I think it makes all of us very attentive to the fact that blessings come to you in very unexpected forms, through the traveler, the unexpected guest, the stranger at the door. So for us, that was, you know, for us as writers, it had the force of a foundational story in a certain way. And then around that, you can constellate all kinds of other realizations which you have somewhere in the back of your mind. I mean, for instance, the neoclassical myth that the great temples of ancient Greece were white. We know that they were not white. They were polychrome. They were painted. They were garlanded. They looked pretty garish. They are not how we imagine them to be, pristine.
And also, those were very unideological times. And in ideological times, I think there's always an ascent of superior technology. So accounting comes, for example, from an Islamic tradition, the compass, and so on and so forth. Of course, everybody knows the numbers. The same thing with the alphabet. To have this kind of alphabet was an incredible cultural advantage. So in ideological times, of course, you would take that up and you would make it into your own, because it makes sense, it's practical, it gives you an edge, it's a weapon, and so on and so forth. So I think this was maybe one of the most important energies of progress, if you're not confined by certain limitations because of xenophobia, nationalism, and so on and so forth, or theology. If you're open to what variety and multitude offers, then of course you're going to pick what is most efficient and what is most beautiful.
To take a cue from what you said, Ranjit, blessings also come in the form of cutlery. There's a very interesting chapter around the whole evolution of etiquettes and forks and things like that. I found that very interesting as a reader. Could you talk a little about that?
Sure. Because the book operates at a range of scales, from theological dispute to things that are taken for granted as elements of everyday material culture. So this notion that cutlery is somehow European, and the West eats with cutlery, the rest eat with whatever they eat with their fingers. So we go back to a point where it's actually the converse that's true. The cutlery was actually invented in the East, in the Byzantine Empire, and it was looked upon with great disfavor in northern Italy, actually, which is where
Venice,
where it was imported. So
yeah, through marriage.
Through marriage, of course, because there was a marriage that connected an important ducal family in Venice with the Byzantine Empire, and the bride comes in with cutlery. And one of the local clerics actually stigmatizes this. The bishop.
In his Sunday sermon, he says, God gave you fingers to use. So it is a sin to use this fork, this bad modern invention coming from the East. Remember, your fingers are what God gave you to use.
And the fork, since it resembles the devil's weapon, was to be stigmatized. That also appears in the sermon.
So actually it was stigmatized for about 100 years. And only thereafter, it's a really interesting story, at the court, at the French court, Louis, what was it, 10th, 11th, something, I've forgotten. Only then, because he, for whatever reason, felt he was a great hunter, so he loved his big meat, chunks of meat, so he felt it would be easier to use a fork together with a knife. Before that, they only used a knife, so they would cut up and then... And the fork was a very late introduction to European culture.
Another interesting, the book runs an interesting gamut of a lot of things, and it's the narrative really travels. I found it very interesting that you I think under the chapter, The Gift of the Magi, you talk about the nativity and the three wise men and sort of dismantle that. It was very interesting for me. If you could comment on that.
Well, this is a huge point. And again, really many people don't know it. So when you speak to people who are Christians or Jews, they assume that the central tenets, beliefs, and imaginations of their religion were invented by this particular religion. And when you point out that actually nearly all the important aspects, something which in theology is called soteriology, actually come from Persia, and that the old Persian religions, and it's not one, there were kind of differing varieties, one could say.
Different religions, Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrianism, the Manichaeans.
Exactly, and different religions. But they introduced concepts like the paradise, they introduced the concept of a savior, of a messiah. They introduced actually probably the concept of time. Because when you think about it, if there's no final reckoning, then there is actually no time. There's an infinity of existence. So the first philosophical step is to imagine that there's an end to existence, both personal existence and existence of mankind. And that is, of course, a huge step in the development of mankind, whether for the better or for the worse, but it's a huge step. And also small things like the hallow and so on and so forth.
Angels,
and of course the angel. So all of that comes from Persia, and it's actually very easy to prove how it came into Judaism. It was because, as everybody knows, Jews spent several centuries in captivity in what was then Babylon, and today is Greater Persia. So when they came back, and this is well established by Judaic scholars, they actually had clashes with the guys who were left behind. So there you have the immigrants, the exiles coming back home, and this happens time and again. I can tell you from my own experience, after '89, going back to Bulgaria, we were the outsiders. So there's always this clash of people who have remained behind, who think they know it better, and who think they have more of a justification to both explain and define reality. So the people back home completely kind of wanted to have nothing to do with these modern new concepts, and they actually, the exiles took over the religion, and they introduced these Persian concepts, and through Judaism it then went into Christianity, of course.
It actually migrated. The transfusion was both West and East. These Persian ideas travel really along the Silk Route and other trading networks. So to take just the soteriological figure, the savior, Saoshyant in Zoroastrian doctrine, that figure travels westwards, it ultimately becomes the Messiah, ultimately becomes the Mahdi, comes eastward, becomes part of a Vaishnav elaboration. So you have the notion of Kalki, but Maitreya, the future Buddha, ultimately reaching the heights of the Amitabha cults in the Far East. All of that comes from this original crucible of religious thinking in Persia, in ancient Iran.
Before I ask my question about Lal Ded, I would like to quickly ask, I think it's an extension of what we're discussing, is erasures around religion in terms of how it evolved. If you could talk a little about that. And also, while we spoke about Sufism and mysticism, you've worked extensively on the Sufi mystic poet Lal Ded. So if you could talk a little about that experience.
I think I would connect what you're saying about Lal Ded with what Ilija said earlier about this tension within any given religious system between the more austere, puritanical, monolithic elements and those that are more disruptive, exploratory, plural. And I think that in each of these, I hesitate to even describe them as religions. Let's call them sort of zones of religious practice. There's always going to be a tension, sometimes amounting to conflict, between questers and mystics on the one hand, to whom truth is not something closed, absolute, and given. It comes through the turning of the human mind and body into a laboratory. It comes from seeking, it comes from invention. So there's that kind of religious impulse, which I think we would all recognize and cherish. And there's the other kind of religious impulse, which seeks the security of the given word, the text, a script that you adhere strictly to, a set of rules, and that you will find in absolutely every tradition. It's a constant conflict. Sometimes there's dialogue, not always. Sometimes there is the attempted erasure of, usually the authoritarian erasure by the orthodox of the more dissident. And for me, Lala is a figure who, as you know, Lala is really not a single figure. It's actually what I've described elsewhere as a contributory lineage. It's many, many generations of questers writing under that signature. And I think they assembled under that signature because it promised a degree of emancipation from authority and ordained texts.
Well, it's just one thought. It's not only erasure in terms of the narratives and the representations, it's also erasure in terms of individual extermination. So when you look at many of the great poets and thinkers in the Sufi tradition, many of them were killed, burned, and so on. When you look at many of the great European free thinkers, many of them were accused by the Inquisition and also either punished or burned at the stake. That basically happens nearly or maybe not in every tradition, but in many, many traditions. So in a way, there's a twofold erasure. First of all, you get rid of this, as you beautifully said, kind of signature of emancipation, and secondly, you erase it from the textbooks. And I think the problem, if you were to ask me to define the book in one sentence, I would say it's an anti-text book. Basically, it tells you all the stories that the textbooks purposely do not tell because they're slightly confusing. And that's why it's such a beautiful title, Guide to the Perplexed. Because I think one thing we shouldn't forget is that clarity and simplicity is the enemy of thought and poetry. So confusion is actually something which is one of the driving forces of any cultural development. And the paradox, that's why both in the Indian and in the different Sufi traditions, and of course in the Koan of Buddhism, the paradox is such an important tool of instruction. It makes you challenge, the Indian tradition, of course, of Ulat Bamsi, turning things on the head. It makes you challenge the established truth and makes you it gives you a headache, but through the long and deep valley of headaches, you actually become someone who has a certain degree of, as you said, emancipation from preconceived notions.
It's interesting that you spoke about erasures of texts, and again, I'm probably hearkening you back to the whole tradition of orality. And in terms of, when you're talking about confluence, how important is that? Now, we've also seen that, we were discussing a while ago, spoken word poetry is gaining currency now. And you've translated Lal Ded, who was in the oral tradition. I don't know of others you could possibly talk about how it impacts, how it impacts confluence in many ways.
Well, first of all, how did the book come about? And it was through a process of orality. So I think the first 2 years, we had conversations. I don't think we wrote down anything. It was maybe in the 3rd year or 4th year. So it was actually this kind of open space of orality, which is so great, where you can add, you can experiment. Writing it down in a way always marks the ground. I mean, there's this beautiful poem by Lal Ded where she says, on pilgrimage, I do not want to burn the ground with my footsteps. So basically the question is, are you treading so lightly that you are leaving marks on the ground or not? So for me, orality is kind of this openness to ever-changing variation and correction. So in a way, I think how we cooperated is a validation of, I think, the principle of orality and how it, in a way it can inspire also écriture.
And much as I value print, there is a way in which print modernity has actually held us hostage. The world of orality is also the world of versions and variations, all of which have equal, simultaneous validity. But it's only when you have print modernity that you begin to have debates about the authenticity of a text, this text over that one, which is the real text. And you then, you then have this emergence of disputation and mutual annihilation around a text that is printed, which formerly existed in different versions, which you could segue among. And that's actually what happens with Lala's poems. They exist in oral circulation. They have different meanings for different kinds of assemblies and groups. It's only after 1920, when it appears in print, that you have this whole argument about interpolation, plagiarism, all of these questions of authorship which did not exist before.
Also, the interesting thing is in the Western tradition, the metaphor for this written disputation within a text is the palimpsest. So this is something which always comes up. So one text written over the other. And in a way it's helpful sometimes, but it closes your mind to the fact that a far more, I think, adequate metaphor would be that the text is continuously rewriting itself, and each version is slightly different from the previous one. So the palimpsest itself is also, I think, in its imagery, a limit of someone who is not open enough to the dynamics of reality.
We'd like to open, the floor to the audience if you have any questions.
Hello. Hello. Yeah. Good evening. Yeah. So I was thinking about how you said that the pop music started because of the segregation of the I think the black community. You said it started from there. So I was worried that over the last decade the globalization was sweeping across many cultures, and it was sort of eating away the diversity. So I was wondering if this Trump era that we live in, it's sort of reversing that. It might be good for culture. And
it's actually a very valid question, and we have a chapter on that particular question in the book, where we point out that this kind of commercialized fusion, a product that is made for global consumption because it has a simplicity of appeal throughout the world, and often that's called fusion, that this is actually the opposite of confluence. So the fact that we are challenging the solidity and uniformity of tradition doesn't mean that at any given moment the tradition is not important. It is, because it's also a technique, it's a cultural technique. So people need to have a certain cultural technique as a starting point, as a foundation, to interact with the other, with the new. So of course, if you have only commodified products which are governed by decisions of marketing, development, and commercial success, then of course you don't have this this particular process of confluence that we describe. So we agree with you that I think both of us that is a certain danger of the globalized world, that you have a dominance of kind of artificial products that are beyond any form of traditional interaction. They're basically, they become something like popcorn, which if you were of an apocalyptic mindset, you probably could say that if this continues for another 50 or 100 years, there'll be no more other left. There'll only be kind of different tastes of popcorn, which of course would not be very conducive to cultural development.
Hello. I had two things. One, I just wanted to ask Ilija whether, because you mentioned how technologies have been developed out of open, ideology-free environments, but I was just wondering what you thought then of how many technologies developed out of military efforts. And my second question, which is a bit unrelated, is I'm interested in how your process as writers did it reflect the idea of confluence itself, and how did you actually write something that seems like a sort of a river that's had, you wouldn't necessarily know whose tributary is whose?
So do you want to do the second part? I'll do the first part. Yeah. Well, very simply, we don't look at contemporary developments for a very simple reason that it's not possible to judge how confluential energies will play out. So this is why we stop at a point in time. So this, what you describe as kind of the military usurpation of technological progress, is of course very much a recent phenomena. So this is not part of the book. It will be very fascinating to ponder on how that will, what effects that will have if you imagine a world in which authoritarian or repressive states through state government are the most important players in technological development, but that is not within the scope of this book. But regarding the process,
it really was, on two levels, it was confluential. I mean, as we said earlier, there was a long process of conversation and research, but we actually sat down and wrote the whole book together. It was like setting out a magical space, in a way, in which to just literally collaborate, in the literal meaning of that word. We talked our way through practically every sentence, or if one of us went away and wrote a section, then we would read it together and rework it. And I think one of the important dimensions of that process was that we each gave way to the others' preferences or suggestions. I mean, I think my form of writing would have been left to myself much more theoretical, much more academic. But I realized the delights and pleasures of writing as if it were fiction. Conversely, but maybe you should speak for how this worked for you. But it was...
Well, all I can say is we learned from one another. He learned to be slightly more punctual, and I learned a lot of patience. So it was a very good learning curve, yeah.
But a quick note on the technology. We all live with things today that came out of military programs. I mean, the internet came out of ARPANET, or a whole range of polymers and capsules, and all kinds of things came out of the Apollo programs. So that, the presence of war and conflict and trade and all of this is part of the rich narrative of Confluence. So I don't think we have a necessarily sharply moral judgment on that, but we're taking a kind of view which allows for all of these different impulses to produce both nectar and poison, and that's what we're bearing witness to in a certain way.
Do you think that the present environment that we are living in, is it historically unique, or you believe we have seen this all before? I mean, because because there are examples of similar religious tension or this one nation, one people, one language, while there are contradictory things that has happened. I mean, even at the height of when the Holy Roman Empire was being attacked by the Ottomans, I mean, we had a Franco-Ottoman alliance. So a lot of the religious tensions probably were rooted in the political part of the world and nothing to do with religion itself. So do you think the current, whatever we are seeing now, is it historically unique? Or, I mean, what's your perspective on that?
Well, it's certainly not unique. We mentioned 1492 in Spain. I would say that's maybe the most radical example of exterminating confluence. It's interesting that the very first thing the Reconquista did, so the very first thing Catholic Spain did after winning the battle against the last remnants of Andalusia, was first of all the expulsion of all Jews within several months. So it was an incredible logistical process, but also it was an incredible priority. Why would that be your priority when you've just conquered the last, as they said, Moorish part of Spain? And then 3 or 4 years later, the expulsion of all Muslims. And not only that, but really, as we described, the erasure. For example, of course, they took over like the wonderful mosque in Cordoba or the Alhambra. These are just a few examples of what happened everywhere on a day-to-day basis. Basically, a complete occupation of this open cultural space and making it into a one-note space. I'm saying one note, sorry, because I just remember the wonderful story by Nasruddin Hoxha, if I may, because to me it encapsulates in an anecdote what we're speaking about. So Nasruddin Hoxha is invited to a concert, and it's some wonderful player of the oud or the sitar, and everybody's saying, wow, wow. And Nasruddin is not impressed. So the host says, but Mullah Nasruddin, didn't you enjoy the concert? And he says, So he says, but can you play? So they give him the sitar or the oud, and Nasruddin keeps striking one note, tong, tong, tong. Everybody is shocked and says, but Mullah Nasruddin, you can't play the instrument. He says, no. You got it all wrong. I have found the right tone. These guys are still looking for it. So this is basically what happened in 1492, and it's happened time and again in history, and we describe certain... So Trump is nothing new. I mean, this one note sitar player is an old phenomenon.
Roger Nasruddin plays the clock, unfortunately, also.
Yeah, also plays the clock. Thank you. With that, we'd like to wrap up this evening. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. And thank you, Ranjit. Thank you, Ilija, for a rather enlightening session.